Welcome to the UIAAA Connection podcast. We thank GoFan and VNN, the exclusive sponsors of the UIAAA Connection. Now operating as one combined company, GoFan and VNN offer a seamless experience through digital ticketing and athletic websites. They make it easy to direct fans to one central place for schedules, communication, and tickets for both home and away events. We appreciate GoFan and VNN for their continued support and exclusive sponsorship of the UIAAA Connection podcast.
Welcome back to another edition of the UIAAA Connection. I'm your host, Mark Hutch Hunter. Today we start our 16th season with episode 1. Our special guest is Nathan Whitaker, #1 New York Times bestselling author and recent general speaker at the conference in the NIAAA conference in Tampa. Welcome to the podcast, Nathan.
Thanks, Hutch. It's great to be here. I appreciate you having me.
Let's have you begin by sharing with our audience quickly where you grew up, where you went to college, your first job, etc.
Okay. I currently live in Gainesville, Florida, which is also where I grew up. I was born in St. Pete, 6th generation Floridian. And my folks moved up here for my dad to go to law school at the University of Florida. So I grew up in Gainesville in northern Florida, about an hour from the Georgia border. Grew up a big Gator and went to a bunch of Florida sporting events and always wanted to be an athlete. I'm undersized. I was a try-hard guy. So I ended up going to Duke and had a chance to play baseball there. I was recruited by a number of Ivies and then Davidson, Duke, some others. And that was the biggest school I was recruited by. So went there to play baseball and then walked on to the football team and played both of those at Duke and then went to law school. I did not have a potential as a player in sports. Couldn't figure out what to do with my English degree. So ended up in law school and spent 3 years up in Boston, up at Harvard, and graduated from there and practiced law for 4 years. I clerked for a federal judge for 2, and then I was with a big firm in North Carolina for 2. And then that's kind of what got me up to speed and kind of launched me, and we'll get to that later, but that's kind of takes you through my first job. My first job was working at the local boys club as basically I was overseeing the t-ball kids and making sure they didn't hit each other with the bats. So it was almost coaching, except it was more just supervising and making sure nobody got injured. But that was my first job along the way, that and a bank teller. And the bank teller was great, except that we've realized I can't count. So every day the head teller would have to come up and count my drawer and make everything work. And it did, but I could never count it. So anyway, those were my early starts, but that's been a number of years ago.
That's awesome. Let me ask you a follow-up about going to Harvard, because for someone like me, I mean, I've never even visited the campus. So someone who's a graduate from Harvard, is it like it's portrayed on TV and the movies? Is it tougher? Is it not as tough? Or just give me just a quick insight to that.
Yeah. So, my age and your age, you probably remember the paper chase and some of those things about Harvard Law School and how scary a place it was. And it had really softened by the time I got there. I did have some of those type professors. What I discovered was that it was a great place to rub shoulders with people who were really, really bright. I'm not always sure I belong in that category, but the people I was around were thinking about interesting things, and they were thinking about those things in a way that I didn't always think about them and coming at it from a different angle. And so that was a great experience for me to be up there and to be around some of those folks, whether professors or my fellow students, just some really, really interesting folks. So anyway, and one of my closest friends was a Utah guy. I met him first day on campus, and he had just graduated from the University of Utah, and he and I are dear friends to this day. And he helped help me navigate everything. And he's one of those people though who does think about things in a different way. Smart guy.
Perfect. Let's have you talk for a minute about your younger years up in Gainesville. Were you able to play all the sports like most of the kids? Because I wouldn't say you're almost my age, but you're a little bit older than maybe some of our listeners. So you're still at the time when it was summertime. You left in the morning and didn't come home until it was dark. Now, of course, kids have their phones and stuff. But talk a little bit about your youth sports experience.
Yeah, no, I totally, when my girls ask what it was like, I'm like, well, you know how in Stranger Things they get kicked out of the house at first thing in the morning and they come back when the street lights come on, that was us in the 80s. So yeah, I was back in the day where, you could, whatever sport was in season is what we played in the field by our house, and then what we played in middle school and then in high school. So in high school, I played baseball, basketball, and football. Had a couple of plays at wide receiver, but I was a kicker and punter. A good friend, about a decade older than me at the University of Florida, taught me how to kick when I was 12. So I wasn't a soccer player, but I was helping him actually prepare for the NFL draft. And I was out with him every day at Florida Field, holding for him. And so he taught me how to kick when I was 12. And that's how I got into that. My 10th grade year of basketball, our JV coach said, you know what's great about you, Nathan? He said, what's great is that you're deceptively weak. And I think he was right. I think he meant it in a good way, but I'm a thin guy, and that was kind of the end of my basketball days. Um, and I played a little more, but realized that I had probably a little bit of a future in football and baseball. And then I played baseball for quite a while, and that was as close to, in Florida, that was as close to year round as I played anything. But again, it was kind of whatever sport was in season was what we played, and I certainly tried my hand at all of them.
Perfect. Let me ask you a little bit of a personal question here, Nathan. What's your biggest failure or disappointment in life, and what did you learn from it?
So, um, well, I've had, so many in some ways. And then let me point out, so I'll talk about a couple. One is that, um, and we'll get to this more when we talk about the Bucks, but when I was working for the Buccaneers, I was on a path. I've got a law background. I was doing contracts with coaches, with players, salary cap stuff, despite my inability to add my bank account or my teller drawer. I was doing salary cap work, and they let me start to do scouting. So they sent me. I went up to Georgia Tech, and then I went over to Duke in North Carolina, and went to some schools and started to scout. And I was watching film with them every day, and so they had me on this GM path. That was the idea, that to broaden me and get me more on the personnel side to become a general manager. And there were eight of us who worked closely together with the Bucks, and seven of the eight either went on to be a team president or a GM. And after a bunch of us got fired in Tampa, and as things happen and front offices change and whatever, and they all went on to do other things, and I didn't. And in part, it was a pivot um, to do the things I'm doing now. And then partly, every now and then, I look at friends who are on TV, either in a role in I'm looking at a press box and I'm seeing guys I worked with, and I think, maybe if I had gone and worked in Arizona or Seattle or some of the offers I had, I could have stuck around the NFL and done that. And so it's a failure in that I didn't get to where I thought I was going to go. But it was
Hmm.
also a conscious decision along the way that I had done that. And I talked to my wife about, is that the lifestyle we want? And we decided no. And so it's this interesting push pull of, I feel like I'm in the right spot, but every now and then this voice in my head's like, oh, that would have been pretty cool. Um, so anyway, I don't know if you can appreciate that, but that sense of even making a conscious, rational decision, there's this part of me that thinks, what if you had gone that other path? The other one that I'll touch on just briefly is, I'm writing books now. I've done one fiction book for kids, but I would love to write adult fiction. I want to write murder mysteries or thrillers, and that's what I read and that's what I enjoy. And I keep writing nonfiction books with really interesting folks. I'm working with somebody in baseball right now. The book hadn't been announced yet, but some others. And so I keep having these neat things come along. And and it's almost a failure of omission, because for 10 years I've had an outline for a fiction book I want to write. And for whatever reason, I just keep getting on to other things. And I think, well, that's something I can deal with another time. And as I get older every day, I find myself going, I wonder if I'm ever going to write that. And that's going to be disappointing to me if I look back and think I never sat down and just put in the time. So that's kind of an ongoing thing that's sticking with me, this omission of, why haven't I done that yet? So anyway.
Well, that's awesome. And of course, you and I have only met in person the one time, but the fact that you have an outline for a fiction book and that you are going to attempt to do that is incredible to me. I think most of my listeners know this. My third book, Castlegate, just came out. It's the one I gave you in Florida.
Right. Right. I've got it right here
But
behind me, and I need to, and yes.
well,
And I told you, and it just to,
yeah,
and I want you to get back to that. But as I told you, I have, if I had a dime for everybody who comes up to me and says, "Oh, I love that you wrote a book. Someday I'd like to write a book," I'd have, I don't know what, but if I had a dime for everybody who said, "Here's my latest book," I'd have like 5 dimes because nobody has actually done it. So
really.
for you to have done 3 of them, you handed it to me and I went, okay, maybe God's telling me, would you write your book, Nathan? Because, I didn't expect at NIAAA somebody to come up and hand me a work of fiction. So anyway, I look forward to reading it.
Well, that's nice, and I look forward to seeing that book when it comes out. Let me ask you this, Nathan. You've been around the block. You've been in the pros, obviously. You've competed in college, high school. From your point of view and where you are right now in your life, compare interscholastic athletics, high school, to the pros, and maybe talk about maybe some of the negative things from the pros that are creeping down into interscholastic athletics.
Sure. So, I think at a basic level, there was a moment in so many teachable moments that came from the Ted Lasso TV show, but there was one where Ted is focused as always on the life lessons, and his assistant coach says, "Wait a minute, I get all that, and I've been on this journey with you through college, through all these other things, but we're in the pros now, and you have to win. It can't all be about life lessons. These people are professionals, and they have to win." And there's definitely truth to that, right? I mean, I was in professional sports for 6 years. And at some point, you have to win, right? I was fortunate enough to get a Super Bowl ring. Next year, we missed the playoffs, and most of us in the front office got fired. And so, it's one year to the next. And in fact, right after we won the Super Bowl, I had a chance to join the Chicago Bears. And the owner came up to me and said, "We're not going to let you go. We're not going to let you interview because we have big plans for you." So fast forward a year, and the big plans were we're firing all of you. So, so anyway, and so I get that. But it was interesting too to work with, especially Tony Dungy. And Tony's point was we can teach life lessons, that these people are professionals to be sure, but they're also going to go out and have lives. And right now they do have lives outside of football. And Chuck Noll said to him, if you make football your life's work, you're really missing out on something. And I think that's true. And so there is this push-pull. The pressure definitely has leaked down to college and then to high schools and the like, as far as, are we winning? Who's getting paid what and why and how? And all those questions matter at some level. They're important to wrestle with and try to come up with some sort of rationale. But it's making things really tough. And one of the benefits we had in the pros that colleges are wrestling with is we had a collective bargaining agreement, and we had contracts, and we had the ability to
Hmm.
enforce those. And so that's a challenge, whether it's a college coach leaving, or college players leaving, or then how that affects high schools. Back when I was in high school, you went where you were zoned, or you were in a magnet program, and that was it. And nobody's worrying about
Right.
who's going wherever. And so just a lot of different pressures. And part of what, whether it was a coach or a player, part of what I learned going to my high school, which um, it was not one of the more athletically, it wasn't as prominent as at least another one in the city, probably the other two in the city. And so you knew you were going to take your lumps, and we were probably always going to be third out of three in a lot of sports. But it gave me a chance to play earlier, and it gave me a chance to learn how to lose, and lose a lot at times. And those were great lessons for me. Talk about learning how to fail, learning to fail in a safe space on the field. It feels devastating. And then you realize the next day, okay, we got another game coming. But all those things, I look and think, boy, I could totally see myself transferring across town now if it was today. And I'm like, hey, this school has no potential to get any better. And if I go here where other kids are getting recruited, think of what it'll do for me. And that would have been hard at the age of 15, 16, 17 to kind of sort through. So anyway, I think I learned a lot of things, but I think some of those pressures have definitely leaked down and are things that have to be wrestled with.
Great insight. Thanks for sharing that. Let me ask you this. I want you to share with our audience the mentors and leaders that you've had in your life that have made a difference. You mentioned Tony Dungy. Maybe you can expand on that, and maybe some other people that have affected you.
Yeah. So I've been really blessed. My last answer talking about 15, 16, 17, what would I have done? One of the things I was really blessed with were parents who were really involved and who taught me that my word was my bond and just so many character lessons along the way. So they would have been a huge help at that age, and they were in dealing with some of those things. And then I clerked for a federal judge. He was actually appointed by Nixon, and I clerked in the 90s so that President Clinton was the president then. So you can do the math on how long he was on the bench even to that date. He just passed away a
Right.
couple years ago. But Judge Hodges was unbelievable, and he would write a check to, this is early days of cell phones, and he hardly ever used his, but it was issued by the government. So he would write a check every month for like $1.67 because he would add up the 2 calls he'd made on his cell phone, and he'd write a check back to the government because those were his personal calls, and it was back in the day when it was kind of for work use only. But just a great example to me of, it may seem small, it may seem de minimis, but he would say, I don't want the appearance of impropriety to ever hang over me. And so that was a great lesson. And then Tony, learned so many things from Tony. I'd already worked for Tom Coughlin in Jacksonville, and then I got to the Buccaneers with Tony, and his kids are running up and down the halls, and they're doing homework in his office, and I was kind of coming off this experience with the Jaguars of, this is my work time, and we've really got to be focused on winning. And some of the folks with the Bucks were like, no, they've blended it because we're going to spend so many hours. I mean, the NFL just requires it. Even if Tony Dungy's the head coach, you're still working Thanksgiving, you're still working Christmas, your weekends are still not your own. So we're going to bring families to us, and we're going to have them at the offices, and we're going to figure this out, and we're going to figure out how to navigate life and go through life in a way that makes sense. And that was really a good lesson for me. The other thing that was a great lesson for me with respect to Tony and the way he approaches things, we were working on his book years later. And again, not to totally skip ahead, but working on his memoir. And so he had been fired right before we won the Super Bowl. And then the rest of us had been fired a couple years later. And I really was still stung by Tony's being fired because it was such a great environment for me to be in. And I just so appreciated him and looked up to him. And so as we were working on his book, I said, how did you get over the bitterness? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, here you'd come to Tampa and you turned around just an awful franchise, and they were winning, and you were doing things by being involved in the schools, and you were doing things in a way that you thought God would honor and God was leading you to do. And then you get fired because all you do is make the wild card round, and you couldn't get all the way to the Super Bowl. And how'd you deal with that bitterness? And he said, Nathan, there was no bitterness. My job is to coach, and God's job is to tell me where. And he said, so what was there to be bitter over? And I said, well, I've been bitter on your behalf for 6 years. And he laughed and said, well, you can let go of that. But it was a great experience even then, older, farther along my life journey, for Tony to say, wait, don't lose sight of the big picture, that it may feel like, yes, this was unjust, this wasn't right, whatever, but there's a much bigger picture at play. And we need to keep sight of that. So I've been blessed with some really insightful folks around me who took an interest in me and really have built into me. So I've been really blessed.
That is some great insight. Let me ask you this. You brought up Tom Coughlin, and I don't know him, never met him. I'm not trying to throw him under the bus, but to me, Tony Dungy was different than all the 32, 31 other coaches because of that family thing that you said. So was that a stark difference working for Coughlin in Jacksonville and then working for Tampa? I think it's a rhetorical question, but
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
So there definitely was. And in fact, Tony had interviewed for the Jaguars job when they gave it to Coach Coughlin. And the owner said in the interview, you keep talking about family, you keep talking about outside interests, but when I hire a coach, I want to know that they are focused completely on the Jaguars. And it sounds like you're going to continue to have outside interests. And Tony said, well, if you view my family as outside interests, then yes, I am going to. And I'm not going to compromise who I am just because I want to be a head coach. Tony was I think he was still at the Vikings as the defensive coordinator. And I really like the Jaguars owner, and ironically, really involved in the community and really family friendly in a lot of ways. And Coach Coughlin was, great. And his wife, in fact, when we moved to Jacksonville and we were getting settled and we were in an apartment, his wife called my wife and said, "Why don't you move in with me and Tom? And, until you get settled." And we didn't. And just the thought of like waking up in the morning and seeing Coach Coughlin, of course, I'd probably wake up in the morning and realize Coach Coughlin had gone to the office 2 hours earlier. So I really enjoyed Coach Coughlin. And what I really appreciated about him from a leadership standpoint was that he was a real straight shooter. There were never any games and there was never any sort of manipulation. It was just he had books of Patton and other leaders that he admired in his office. But he was so focused on, we're going to figure out what it takes to win games, and we're going to do that. And we're going to, if it helps us in that goal, then we'll continue on that path. If it doesn't, then let's just set it aside. And so that was hard for me as a young husband and then a young father to reconcile. So yes, it was very different, but then I ended up, I appreciated him as well. And I think he pivoted a little bit with the Giants. I think he changed along the way, I think, as far as, we all get a little older, a little wiser, and we learn things as we go. So some of the stories I've heard from his time with the Giants were different than with the Jaguars.
And that's an interesting observation because, as everyone knows, they're both Super Bowl champion coaches. And
Right.
It just goes to show that there's not always one right way, depending on your coach and his vision, his leadership. So thank you for sharing that. Let's go back to your Duke days. You didn't play basketball for him, but just thoughts on Krzyzewski as a coach.
Yeah, so an amazing coach, obviously. One of the things that I think was interesting from my time and what I observed, I was there in the late 80s. And so he had been hired in 83, 84, something like that. And, two thoughts that I think really are interesting about Coach K. I think he was in his third season and they lost to somebody, Cornell, Princeton, somebody they shouldn't have, and they were struggling. And papers, Durham Morning Sun is asking, Durham Morning Herald, whatever, I forget the paper now, was asking, should he be fired, and all this speculation. And the athletic director walked into Coach K's office, and Coach K has told this story to this day. The AD walked into his office after this devastating loss. They'd already had 2 losing seasons. The AD walks into Coach K's office and said, "I believe in you." And Coach K went, "Okay, great. Now what? Are you firing me or what?" And he said, "No, I believe in you. You're the right person for this job. I believe in you." And he walked out. And that was it. And then, of course, the next year they bring in Allery and Henderson and Billis and Dawkins, and it's nothing but
Sure.
But that was a really informative moment for the AD to be able to look past the on-court results and say, "No, I've got the right person. We just haven't gotten it all figured out yet." And the other piece to that I thought was really interesting in watching Coach K was my freshman year. They were better. They had gone to the final against Louisville the year before, or 2 years before, and had lost. And then great team my freshman year, undersized team, played great defense, whatever, and then lost 3 of the last 4 of the regular season, like 20-2, and then all of a sudden they were 20-5 with losses. 2 of them were to unranked teams, and I remember thinking, well, that's too bad. It's been a fun year, and turns out they're just not that good. And they went on a run to the Final Four. And my 4 years in college, we went to 4 Final Fours and finally won it my senior year, and went to the Final Four. And Coach K was saying during that, he said, "Yeah, we looked terrible in losing to an unranked Clemson team and an unranked NC State or somebody who always gave us fits anyway, because it was NC State." But he said, it's a process. And we were growing through those losses. And sometimes we can teach better in the losses than we can in wins, that we get things on tape that we need to correct. We get effort issues, we get whatever it is, and we can learn from losses. And so where I thought as an outsider, well, they're just not that good, and this is a blown season, they actually used those as a springboard to continue to improve and get better and go on a run. So those were great. I thought those were a couple of great things. One, the quote from the AD, and then two, just watching Coach K view it as a process of how to grow and how to get better.
You were at Duke then during the Grant Hill to Leitner Elite
I
Eight path.
was. I was that was actually my first year out. My
Okay, all right.
That was my first year out. That was at Harvard at the time. So my 91 was when we my last year was when we beat the undefeated UNLV team
Oh,
in the national
yes,
semis. And
that's
then
awesome.
went on to win it. Yes. So Grant was a freshman when I was a senior. So I like to think of myself as a mentor for Grant, even though we did not interact at all in college. But anyway, I just so anyway, no, what
Well,
a
that's awesome. You're a mentor for Grant, and you appreciate this because I'm old enough to realize that Grant Hill's father was Calvin Hill, who played for the Cowboys, and I'm not sure a whole lot of people understand that his dad
yeah,
was just as famous as he was in his
right,
day.
right. No, in fact, when he got to campus, I mean, again, we're looking back 30 years now, but when he got to campus, we were all like, "Oh, that's Calvin Hill's son. That's really cool."
Yeah,
And now, of course, he's Grant and he stands on his own. So, and thankfully
absolutely.
for Duke, great ambassador.
Well, let's have you share this. So it's probably been 2.5 weeks ago that I met you. You were the closing speaker at the NIAAA conference in Tampa. And I guess my question is, so how does someone, a New York Times bestselling author, former football executive, motivational speaker, and all of a sudden the NIAAA gets you to come to Tampa? And apparently, from what I read the other day on Facebook, well, you said this in your talk, but it was your first time back since you took the bar in the same building. So talk about
Right.
how that all happened.
Right. So it was probably 5 or 6 years ago. My most recent book with Coach Dungy had come out, a book on team building called The Soul of a Team. And an athletic director in Austria, he's in an international school in Austria, tweeted out a photo of the book and said, "I'm looking forward to reading this." And so I just responded, "I hope you like it." And so we started communicating. And I did an online session with some athletic directors in Europe. Um, and then from that, got invited to do a conference in Bangkok with athletic directors in Asia, and so had some interesting experiences. And along the way, he introduced me to Rich Barton, who's with the NIAAA, who you know from his time in Utah before he went there. And so I was speaking at a financial services firm maybe 2 years ago in Indianapolis. And I landed and was driving to this financial services firm to go speak to all their advisors and realized, and I don't know what, maybe I don't know if I saw an exit or saw something on the building, but I saw NIAAA and realized, so I
Mhm.
pulled over and went in and met Phil and Rich there in person. And so anyway, they called me this spring and said, "Hey, would you consider coming?" And I'd love to. And I do so many things with I do some things with athletic directors. I do so many things in the corporate market, which is great, talking team building, leadership, whatever. But I do love when I can speak to folks who are impacting youth and working with kids and sorting through issues with coaches and how we deal with kids. I love it. So anyway, it was a great experience, and I was thrilled to be back. But yes, somebody asked me the other day, was I more nervous giving the keynote or taking the bar exam when I was in the Tampa Convention Center? And I said, bar exam, no question, much more nervous. So you guys were a much friendlier group. So anyway, it was a good experience, and I'm really glad I got to be there.
So let me ask you this, Nathan. Uh, how many days are you on the road a year? How many times are you out speaking to corporate, to ADs, to
Yeah.
coaches, that type of a thing, civic groups? How many days are you gone a year? How many
Yeah.
average days?
So I've been pretty fortunate. I mean, some people might think it's not fortunate, but so I'm not on the road that much. I've got friends who do this. I've met people on the speaking tour who are on the road 200 plus nights a year, and that's just of not a ton of interest to me. But I'm on the road several nights a month, and my wife has a flexible job where she often can go with me. I've got an assistant who helps me line up things, so it is fairly seamless. But it's several nights a month, and I'm not going to go on the road. these next 2 months, I've got a book that I'm in the middle of. And so I try to balance that and figure out when do I need to be home and immersed in writing a manuscript versus when am I going to hit the road and speak. And so anyway, trying to balance that and do enough to where I'm involved and have a chance to impact folks with my talks and workshops, but then also being at home and doing the things I need to do here, including chaining myself to my desk and putting words on paper, which right? I mean, people are
Right.
like, "Oh, isn't it fun?" And I'm like, "Well, it might be fun for the first paragraph or two, but then there's a whole middle section of 100,000 words that is a whole lot less fun and is a job." So you'll
Yeah.
appreciate
So,
it.
so, so let me follow up on that because, and I can only speak from my experience. So, and I need to preface that because you're an English major, but I was maybe the world's worst English student in high school that you could possibly have. Seriously. So I got the idea to write my first book. This is way back in 19, well, you were still a senior at Duke, way back in 1990.
Okay.
But I had read a lot of Ludlum and some Clive Cussler, just some mystery
Yeah.
adventure type guys. And I thought, well, and I've read some other people, I won't mention their names, but I said, I'm not as good as Cussler. I'm not as good as Ludlum, but I have an idea. I can write about places I've been in Utah and Arizona. I'm going to give this a whirl. I'm going to try writing. And it was all up in my head. So my first book, I just wrote and then I was done when I got to the end. When I got to my second book, which happens Hoodoo, which is in the Depression era, I had to do research and I had to outline and what chapter goes here and there. And when I got to my third book, Castlegate, which happens 20 years after the first one, it was even more difficult. Having said that, I'm not sure that our audience understands how hard it is to write a book, number one. Talk about the behind the scene work, and you've become a number one best-selling author. I mean, that's we that write books, want that. But I think give the audience a little bit of insight. You just don't sit down and start writing, and it's there. That there's some work to it.
Yeah, it's yeah, it's quite a challenge. But so I've had my approach is more similar to your second book. And one of the things I've learned along the way is if I have to do research, and usually I do if I'm working on somebody's memoir or some sort of leadership book or whatever it may be, is I've learned to not get bogged down in the research while I'm writing, to sit there and
Mm.
come up with my best recollection of the story, or if I don't have enough of the details from them about the story, or if I don't really understand the Depression era and how that tied in, to write it kind of as best as I can and keep going. And I got that in, I read an interview maybe with Walter Mosley or somebody, but a mystery writer. And he said, whoever it was that I was reading said, if you've got somebody getting shot with a gun in his, and you don't know if it's a revolver or a Glock, and you don't know if the hammer makes a sound when it falls or if the gun even has a hammer, just write it and then go back later and do it. Because if you stop every time you don't know something, you're going to write a little bit and stop and write a little bit and stop. And I'm ADHD, and when I stop to do research, I'll be like, oh my gosh, I didn't know the first gun manufacturer was in whatever. And all of a sudden I'm on this path of nothing about does the hammer make a sound? I'm doing whatever. So I learned that. The other thing I learned, I did it from the beginning, but then I've learned it's right for me, is that I did your approach on the second book, is that I outlined heavily when I was writing. So I got fired by the Bucks, just a little bit of backstory to the extent that anybody's interested, but I get fired by the Bucks and actually had a job offer from a financial planning firm. I was going to be a financial planner and was taking the series whatever test that you have to take to be a licensed broker, and was going through all that. And then all of a sudden I'm like, this is great for other people. I don't know this is what I want to do. And I think Tony Dungy's story could help people. So I flew to Indy, talked to Tony about writing a book, and Tony said, absolutely not. Nobody wants to read about me. I got nothing to say. And I tried to convince him otherwise. It took me 3 years to talk him into it. So I was unemployed for 3 years trying to talk him into writing a book. And so finally, we were going to write this book. He agrees to do it. They've just won the Super Bowl, and publishers are interested, and we've got a publisher lined up. And a friend who had, at the time I had one author friend, and I called him and I said, okay, we told the publisher we could write this manuscript in a month so they could get it out before the next season. And what do I do? And thinking he'd have all these tips and tricks for me. And he said, write what you would want to read. And I said, okay, great. And I'm like, all right, what's next? And he's like, that's all I got. And you'll appreciate this. On the one hand, it was really helpful because what I like to read were fiction, books of fiction. And what I didn't like a lot of times were sports biographies because I felt like there's a lot of facts and figures and a lot of whatever and third down and this happened or whatever. And so I thought, okay, as a reader, what would keep me going? And so I tried to have the pacing and the story of Tony's. I mean, I was bound by the story. I couldn't make up anything. But when putting down Tony's story, think, okay, where do we break a chapter here? Do we really finish this story that's going to come into play 20 years later, or do we make the reader work for it and keep going? And so anyway, I think that did help, hopefully, the book along the way to help me write it. But the other thing I did that was really helpful to me was that I decided on my own that I needed to outline it because I wasn't sure. So I took all my notes from Tony and I had legal sheets and it was, childhood. And I figured out every story I had and referenced back to, legal pad number 8, page 14, this story. So then I had this master outline where I could go, okay, now I'm on to his days at the University of Minnesota. Okay, I need legal pads 12, 14, 18. And so I keep flipping back and I find the stories and I put it in. And when I went to write the youth fiction book that I wrote a few years ago after I wrote Tim Tebow's book, the publisher came back and said, great, would you do a book for boys? And so I had this idea for a book. And I had just read Stephen King's book on writing, where he talks about allowing the characters to make the story happen and that he does an outline. And so I thought, okay, now I'm doing fiction. The rules are different. And so I'll just let the characters, I'm like 2 months into it and the characters haven't done anything and nothing's happening and nobody's telling me whatever. And it's just sitting there and I'm totally frustrated. And I talked to another, by now I had other author friends, and I talked to one of them and he went, did you read King's book? And I said, yeah. And he said, yeah. He's just wired differently than the rest of us. His brain, the characters do stuff. He said, my characters don't do anything. He said, so I outline and he said, if that's what works for you, then do that. And so I've continued to outline every book since then and figure out, okay, what needs to happen, including that fiction book. So that's been my writing process. And so then I had something handy the other day. I don't think I left it out to where I could grab it for this, but when I first worked on Tony's book, his first book, and I've done it every book since, I've put down, I need to hit the 85,000 word mark or whatever the deadline, whatever the contract calls for, and how long I've got. And so then I figure out, each day I need to be writing 1,000 words or 2,000 words or whatever it is. And so I just plug in at the end of the day, I do my word count to date. What was my word count yesterday? Okay, I wrote 1,834 words today. I plug it into my Excel spreadsheet. And then on the page after it, I've created another spreadsheet that has a pie chart. And the pie chart keeps getting smaller as far as what I've got, because it's so daunting when you're writing the 50, 60, 100,000 word book and you're 500 words in, you're going, oh my gosh. But when I can see the pie chart getting smaller, and when I have this sense of, okay, I'm getting it out there and I can revise it, I can edit it. Yes, it may be terrible, but I can't edit a blank page, right? I've got to get something out there so that I can come back and fix it. And so that's made a big difference for me. It's just that idea of, yes, it's a slog and yes, it's a challenge, but if I figure out, and then the final piece of that with the outline is that, yes, 60,000 words on leadership is a lot. But if I've got 12 points and those are my 12 chapters, and that means I've got to write 5,000 words on empowering others as a leader. Oh, 5,000 words. Well, that's not even 20 pages. Okay. Can I write 18 pages? Yeah, I've got 7 stories. And so anyway, all of a sudden everything becomes more doable and it's less of a mountain to climb. And I think I don't have to write 60,000 words on this. I got to write 5,000 words on this topic. I can do that. And again, they may not be good words, but I'll fix them later. So.
Well, that's fascinating. And I feel better about my writing process now because I didn't have legal pads 17, 18, 19. My son talked me into using 3x5 cards. And so I would write the gist of the scene. But then I did the same thing. Well, I can move this. Well, I'll move this back in here. And
Yeah.
that's just fascinating that you share that with everyone. So I hope that everyone who even just writes not novels but other things takes a listen to that. Let me ask you this, Nathan, as we get towards the end of this. And you talked about this in Tampa, and I think this would really be helpful for our ADs out there in the U.S. and across the world. Some of the key points, the highlights of team building, and I know you give dozens and dozens of speeches a year, and I know you talked about this in Tampa, but maybe take 3 or 4 minutes and just give the best team building Cliff Notes version, if you will.
Okay, sure. Um, yeah, Tony and I did a book a couple of years ago called The Soul of a Team. And in fact, it's right here. I didn't mean to do I would have had it handy if I was going to do the true book plug, but The
Yeah.
Soul of a Team. And it was on team building. And what we did, this was actually kind of fun. You'll appreciate this. We actually were initially writing a traditional team building book, mission, vision, values, culture, alignment, etc., proven tactics. But Tony didn't have a whole lot of new stories because this was our eighth book together, including a 365-day daily devotional where we had a different story every day. And
Mm.
so the publisher said, we really want something fresh and new. And so I went back and rewrote it as a fable. So it's the Orlando Vipers football team that's in the NFL, and they're totally dysfunctional. And we used stories that we had seen from other teams and things where we'd never talked about them because Tony didn't want to embarrass anybody for
Right.
things he had seen. And so we took some of those, fictionalized them, and Tony gets called in as a consultant to the Orlando Vipers. And he had four basic points that he wanted to get across. And it was again fun to do these books with Tony because we're brainstorming and I'm talking through things I've seen and he's talking through things he's seen. And so we boiled it down to four essential elements that spell out the word soul. And so it's being selfless, and it's owning your role, and it's being unified, and then it's having a larger purpose, this sense of why we're doing what we're doing. And so Tony then works with the Vipers and starts to talk to them about what it means to be selfless and to understand if you're not always going to get credit. Is it necessary that you get credit? Hopefully, you've got a leader who gives appropriate credit at the right times. But do you have to get credit in order to do what you're supposed to do? And then that leads you to, are you doing what you're supposed to do? Are you owning your role? The Bill Belichick, do your job, right? This whole thing of owning your role and then being unified and how you're helping others, slightly different than selfless, I think, and that how are you helping others around you get better as well. And then finally, this larger purpose, this idea that if all we're doing is trying to win games, if all we're doing is try in a company that's just trying to make a profit and increase shareholder revenue, I mean, or value, those are important things. But it's really hard to say, well, I'm not going to have any individual goals then, and I'm going to put those aside for the team. And I'm, going to go home late and miss dinner and whatever, just so we can maximize shareholder value or just so we can win some games or whatever. If there's not something bigger, then it gets hard to get people to buy in. So those were our four elements, and I just launched an online course that talks through those four elements. But I do a lot of that, whether it's workshops or speaking, because they're easy. Even the Duke grads, right, can figure out. I can spell soul and remember what those are. And so that's kind of my Cliff Notes version to really highly effective teams and high performing teams. Because at the end of the day, you're hoping that the team is better than the collection of its parts, right? And so there's got to be something more that makes people work together well, and you get more out of the whole than you do. That's just the sum of the parts.
That is well said. Let's finish up with a couple of questions. The first one being this: from your station in life, if you had two pieces of advice for a brand new high school athletic director in order to be successful, and they had to follow Nathan's advice to become successful, what would those two pieces of advice be?
So trying to not make it three, because three things are coming to mind. But anyway, so one, I think.
You can do three. That's all
All
right.
right. All right. So I'll do two and then I'll kind of throw in a bonus. But one is to be yourself. That when Tony won the Super Bowl, and you touched on this earlier, when Tony won the Super Bowl, he said, I've always said that I want to win a Super Bowl, right? I'm trying to achieve this. I'm working in this industry. This is the goal, is to keep winning and to win our final game. But I've always told our players, I've always told kind of like Chuck Noll said to me, if winning the Super Bowl is the ultimate thing in my life, then I'm going to get there and realize there's nothing beyond that, right? I mean, if there are no other values in my life than that, then what have I done? And he said, but I'm glad we won it. One, because I wanted to achieve it. But two, to show people that there are different ways to get there. And he said, I want other coaches, other people to see if you're wired like Nick Saban and that's just how you are, or Bill Belichick or Tom Coughlin, great. If you're wired like me, great. He said, I don't need to become Tom Coughlin. And Tom Coughlin doesn't need to become Tony Dungy, that he's wired a particular way. And that's okay. If there are things he can learn from me, then that makes sense. If there are things that I can learn from him, and he said, and I have learned things from them and ways to adjust and to be different, great. But I need to be who I am, and I don't need to change to fit some model of, well, now I'm the boss. Now I need to be this way with my personality or whatever it may be. Second point is to keep growing. That I'm 56, and every time, I think I mentioned it in Tampa, but every time I go to an event or whatever, I try to sit in on other people's sessions, even if they're on topics that don't seem to matter to me. I mean, as far as why I would need to be in some sort of, practice schedule, how to work out practice schedules in one gym or whatever it is. You're talking about that. And I'm like, why would that matter to me? And then you're hearing somebody talk and they're talking about, what though? It's more than just scheduling. It's about relationships. And that's my final piece. So one is learn whenever I can. And then the final piece is that all this so much of leadership comes down to relationships, and that it's just so important to understand where people are coming from and to help them understand where you're coming from. And there may be times when you're like, hey, look, this is the answer and that's how it's going to be, and you're going to have to live with it. But to the extent we have a relationship, and it's not always my way or the highway, or it's not always I'm going to give you things without explaining them, or whatever it may be, that I can get to know you, understand where you're coming from. You can understand where I'm coming from. We've built some relationship. Then that makes so much, that gives you so much goodwill and so much of a sense to kind of try to work together and grow together as you do that. So keep growing, build relationships, and then be yourself. Be who you are and how you were wired to be. And yes, can you learn and grow? And are there things that you can do better? Maybe, sure. But don't decide that now I'm the head coach or now I'm the AD, so I've got to become whoever you think the model of it is, right? I mean, if somebody's not wired like you, Hutch, then they don't need to become you, but they can learn things you do and better ways to do things. So those would be my pieces.
That is so well said. Thank you for sharing. We'll finish with this, Nathan. What question should I have asked you that I failed to ask?
Yeah. The obvious question people ask is why my modeling career didn't take off. No, not really. Yeah. I don't know. I appreciated the questions you had. I feel like we covered the waterfront pretty well. I'll tell you, so one thing, and I don't know what the question this would be, but it was something you said earlier about reading and saying, okay, I'm not Clive Cussler, but I can write this story. And that was daunting for me. English major. Two things happened when I was at Duke as an English major. One, I started reading Pat Conroy, Great Santini, Water is Wide, Prince of Tides, writing about the South Carolina Low Country, and Pat and I got to meet him later in life. Which was a cool thing, spend an evening with him. But he could write about the sun coming up over the tidal marsh in South Carolina in a page and a half, and it was like you were there. It was like you were watching a movie. And I'm 19 years old and I'm reading this and I'm like, one, I don't even know half these words and I'm having to stop and look them up. And two, I could never put them together like this. This is beyond me, right? Pat Conroy is an amazing writer and I can't write. And then the other was that Duke offered a creative writing class. They only offered one. And so I had to submit like a 5-page sample and didn't get into the class. And those two things together reinforced for me that, writing is something that other people do. I'm an English major, but really an English lit major. I can read English. And so I guess I'm a reader. And so when I went back and spoke at Duke a number of years ago, after I had written books and hit number one and done other things, they said, do you think Duke was a major part of your process here? And I said, Duke actually, not really Duke's fault, but it was a hang up for me because I took this baggage on of things I couldn't do based on I thought, well, I'm no Clive Cussler or Pat Conroy, and I'm no, well, therefore I can't. Well, it took me a while to get over that and realize I may just have a different path to get there. And I still don't write like Pat Conroy, and that's okay. But I'm doing my best, and hopefully sometimes that's okay and enough.
That is awesome. On that note, that wraps up this edition of the UIAAA Connection. Again, our special guest today has been Nathan Whitaker, #1 New York bestselling author and a recent speaker at the NIAAA National Conference. Nathan, I can't thank you enough for being on the podcast.
Hutch, I appreciate it. Thanks so much for extending this chance to be with the UIAAA.
For our listeners, we hope you tune in again next week for another edition of the UIAAA Connection.